At exactly 11:47 p.m., I whispered 7 names into a calabash filled with red palm oil and bitter cola. By morning, 3 of those women couldn't get out of bed. Blessing sits alone in a dimly lit room at night, kneeling before a small shrine with candles, red cloth, and a calabash. Her hands tremble as she whispers names, women's names, into the vessel. Her face shows a dangerous mix of pain, anger, and satisfaction. The camera pulls back to reveal photos of her husband with different women scattered on the floor around her. The atmosphere is dark, spiritually charged, and filled with the weight of consequences about to unfold. Years earlier, Blessing and her husband Chukwudi had been the envy of their Enugu community. She ran a successful fabric shop in the main market. He worked as a mid-level civil servant, and together they had built a comfortable home with 2 children. Sunday services at their church were never missed. Neighbors called them blessed couple. Blessing had believed in the strength of her marriage, built on prayers, patience, and partnership. The late nights began subtly. Chukwudi would say he had office work or drinks with colleagues. Blessing noticed but chose trust over suspicion, telling herself that a good wife doesn't accuse without proof. Then came the small changes: new cologne, extra attention to his appearance, phone calls taken outside, sudden interest in going out more often. She prayed harder, cooked his favorite meals, dressed better, hoping silently that whatever was pulling him away would pass. One Saturday morning, while cleaning their bedroom, Blessing found a crumpled hotel receipt in the pocket of Chukwudi's trousers. The date was from a weeknight when he'd claimed to be working late. Her hands shook as she smoothed it out on the bed. Later that week, a strange number kept appearing on the phone bill. Dozens of calls, some lasting over an hour. When she finally confronted him, holding the receipt and the bill, he went silent for a long moment before collapsing into apologies. The village church became involved quickly. Blessing, broken and unsure, had confided in the pastor's wife, who organized a family restoration meeting. Elders sat with them in the pastor's office, quoting scriptures about forgiveness, the sanctity of marriage, and the devil's schemes to destroy homes. Chukwudi wept openly, swearing on the Bible that it was one mistake, that he was weak, that he loved only her. The pastor prayed over them, anointed their heads with oil, and sent them home with instructions to rebuild trust through prayer and submission. Months pass. Blessing tries to move forward, forcing smiles, attending marriage counseling sessions at church, and convincing herself things are better. Then she sees it. Late one night, unable to sleep, she picks up Chukwudi's phone while he's in the shower. WhatsApp is open. A chat with a contact saved as Ade Shop. The messages are unmistakable, intimate, ongoing, recent. Worse, there are voice notes, a young woman's laughter, playful teasing, arrangement to meet. The timestamp shows a message sent just hours ago. The next morning, Blessing doesn't confront him. Instead, she goes to the market as usual, smiling at customers, folding fabrics mechanically while her mind races. A market woman, older, widowed, known for being spiritually connected, notices her distress and pulls her aside. "Nah, I know that look," the woman says quietly. "What is troubling you?" Blessing hesitates, then breaks. The woman listens, nods knowingly, and finally says, "There are ways to protect yourself, ways the church won't tell you about. If you want, I know someone who can help. That evening, Blessing finds herself walking down a narrow path outside town, toward a compound she's heard whispered about but never visited. A native doctor sits waiting, reading her face before she even speaks. The native doctor listens to her story, his face unreadable. He performs a brief ritual, cowries thrown, incense burning, muttered incantations. Finally, he looks up. "You want protection?" he asks. "Yes," Blessing whispers. "Only protection?" His eyes pierce through her. She hesitates. Images flash through her mind. Chukwudi's lies, the shop girl's laughter in those voice notes, the church elders telling her to submit, her own humiliation. Her voice comes out harder than she intends. "I want them to feel what I feel." The native doctor nods slowly, a small, knowing smile crossing his face. "Then we will not just protect, we will strike." He reaches for a calabash, fills it with palm oil, and begins listing what he'll need. Her husband's shirt, photographs of the women if possible, 7 bitter coolers, red cloth, and her word, spoken aloud, that she accepts the consequences. The next morning, Blessing doesn't confront him. Instead, she goes to the market as usual, smiling at customers, folding fabrics mechanically while her mind races. A market woman, older, widowed, known for being spiritually connected, notices her distress and pulls her aside. "Nay, I know that look," the woman says quietly. "What is troubling you?" Blessing hesitates, then breaks. The woman listens, nods knowingly, and finally says, "There are ways to protect yourself, ways the church won't tell you about. If you want, I know someone who can help." That evening, Blessing finds herself walking down a narrow path outside town, toward a compound she's heard whispered about but never visited. A native doctor sits waiting, reading her face before she even speaks. In flashback, we see Blessing 3 nights earlier, alone in her backyard after midnight. She had buried Chukwudi's old shirt under a young palm tree, placed photographs of Adaize, secretly taken from her husband's phone, in the calabash with red oil and bitter kola, and whispered the incantation the native doctor taught her. Each word felt like a betrayal of everything she'd been raised to believe, yet each word also felt like reclaiming stolen power. "Let every woman who lies with my husband feel fire in her body. Let sleep flee from them. Let their beauty turn to ashes." She poured the oil into the earth, covered it with red cloth, and walked back into her house. Chukwudi was snoring. She lay beside him, wide awake, wondering if she just made a terrible mistake or the smartest move of her life. When Chukwudi heard about Adaize's illness, he came home pale and shaking. He stared at Blessing across the dinner table, his voice low and dangerous. "What did you do?" Blessing looked up calmly, stirring soup. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play with me," he hissed. "That girl is sick. People are saying someone did something to her. Was it you? Did you go to a native doctor?" She met his eyes without flinching. "Maybe she's just paying for her sins. Isn't that what the pastor says? That sin brings consequences?" His face twisted with fear and fury. He slammed his hand on the table. "If you've done juju, Blessing, you will destroy this family. You will bring a curse on all of us." Word of the accusations reached their families quickly. A meeting was called. On one side, Chukwudi's mother and siblings, the church pastor, and some elders who insisted Blessing must confess and repent if she'd tampered with dark forces. On the other side, Blessing's younger sister, and a few market women who muttered that men always blame women for the consequences of their own actions. The pastor spoke sternly. Sister Blessing, have you consulted any native doctor or traditional healer since your marital troubles began? The room went silent, all eyes on her. She looked around at the judgment, the fear, the barely hidden satisfaction on her mother-in-law's face at catching her in sin. And if I did, she asked quietly, where was this concern when he was breaking our marriage bed? Gasps rippled through the room. 2 weeks later, another woman, this one a former co-worker of Chukwudi's, was involved in a motorbike accident. She survived but broke her leg in 3 places and lost several teeth. Whispers intensified. People started avoiding Blessing in the market. Customers who used to linger now bought quickly and left. Someone spray-painted witch on her shop shutter one night. Blessing stood in front of the graffiti, staring at the dripping red letters. She felt her power and her isolation growing in equal measure. The church organized a spiritual warfare deliverance service, ostensibly for the community, but clearly aimed at flushing out whoever was behind the attacks. The sanctuary was packed. The pastor called for anyone operating in darkness to come forward and confess before God's judgment fell. Blessing sat in the middle pew, heart pounding. The worship grew louder, more intense. People began shouting, speaking in tongues, falling down. Then the pastor pointed, not quite at her, but close. There is someone here, he declared, voice booming, whose hands are stained with spiritual blood. Confess now or face the wrath of God. Blessing felt the walls closing in. Her chest tightened. The woman beside her edged away. Faces turned toward her, suspicion hardening into certainty. Unable to bear it, she stood abruptly and walked out, the congregation's murmurs following her like a swarm. In the aftermath, Chukwudi packed his things, not to repent or reconcile, but to leave. He moved in with one of the mistresses who hadn't been cursed, a woman from another town Blessing hadn't known about. He told people Blessing had become spiritually dangerous and that he feared for his life. Blessing stood in their bedroom, staring at the empty closet. She had done all of this, cursed his lovers, defied the church, lost her reputation, and he still left. The curses hadn't brought him back. They hadn't made him sorry. They'd only given him an excuse to abandon her publicly with community sympathy on his side. For a brief moment, she thought, maybe if she undoes the curses, explains, repents publicly, he might return and things could be fixed. Within weeks, Blessing's fabric business began to collapse. Customers stopped coming. Suppliers refused to deliver goods. Her best seamstresses quit, saying their own relatives warned them against working for her. Bank loans she'd been servicing suddenly came due with threats of seizure. Her children faced bullying at school. Other kids called their mother a witch. She returned to the native doctor, demanding to know why everything was falling apart. He looked at her gravely. You asked for fire. Fire does not discriminate. When you curse others, the smoke also covers you. The spiritual world demands balance. She felt her stomach drop. So what do I do? You must break the charm, and you must make peace with those you cursed, or the fire will consume you completely. Blessing made 2 trips in one day. First, back to the native doctor's compound, where she brought money, cola, and the red cloth she'd buried. Together they performed a breaking ritual, digging up the cloth, pouring libations, reciting counter incantations. She wept as she did it, not from sadness, but from the sheer exhaustion of carrying so much anger. Then, as the sun set, she walked to the church. It was empty except for the pastor, who was preparing for evening service. She stood at the door, trembling. "I did it," she said simply. "I cursed them, and now I'm asking, how do I make it right?" The pastor looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. The act ended with that question hanging in the air, unanswered, as the camera pulled back, showing Blessing alone in the vast, echoing church, shadows lengthening around her. Blessing sat in her empty shop, surrounded by unsold fabrics covered in dust. The sign outside hung crooked. Someone had torn half of it down. Her phone had stopped ringing weeks ago. Her children were staying with her sister temporarily until things calmed down. Chukwudi's family had taken most of the furniture from the house, claiming she'd forfeited her rights by practicing witchcraft. She was alone, truly, completely alone for the first time in her adult life. But in that silence, something unexpected began to grow. Clarity. In quiet moments, Blessing tallied the cost. Her marriage, gone. But perhaps it had been dying long before the curses. Her reputation, shattered, though built partly on performance and silence. Her business, struggling, but customers were slowly returning after she publicly apologized at the market square, admitting her actions and asking forgiveness. Her faith, complicated now, no longer the simple obedience of before, but something deeper, more questioning, more honest. The hardest loss was seeing fear in her children's eyes when they visited. They'd heard the rumors, seen the graffiti, endured the teasing. They looked at her like she was a stranger. The pastor gave Blessing a path forward: public confession, restitution where possible, and a period of spiritual mentorship. She agreed. At a Sunday service, one she attended despite whispers and stares, she stood before the congregation and spoke. "I let my pain turn me into someone I'm not. I sought revenge when I should have sought healing. I'm sorry. To God, to this church, to the women I cursed, and to my family. I'm working to make it right." Her voice shook, but she didn't look down. After the service, the pastor's wife approached her with something unexpected: an embrace. "Thank you," the woman whispered, "for showing us that even when we fall, we can get back up." The hardest step was visiting the women she'd cursed. Adaze, the shop girl, had recovered physically but was still shaken. Blessing found her at the market, and the younger woman's eyes filled with fear when she saw her approach. "I'm not here to hurt you," Blessing said quietly. "I'm here to say I'm sorry. What I did was wrong. You didn't deserve it. Nobody did." Adaze stared at her, suspicious, then slowly nodded. "You ruined my life for weeks," she said flatly, "because of a man who isn't even worth it." "I know. He wasn't worth what I lost either." They stood in awkward silence. Then Adaze surprised her. "He's already cheating on the new woman," she said with a bitter laugh. "Some men just can't change." One evening, Chukwudi called. His voice was strained. "The woman I'm with now, she's not what I thought. Things are hard. Maybe we could talk about trying again, for the children." Blessing felt the old reflex rising, the urge to fix, to forgive, to take him back, because that's what wives do. For a moment, she almost said yes. The temporary hope of restored family, of not being alone, of redemption through reunion dangled before her. But then she remembered the lies, the public humiliation, the way he left when she needed him most, the years of small deaths before the curse ever happened. "No," she said softly. "What?" He sounded genuinely shocked. "I said no. I forgive you, Chukwudi, but I don't want you back."
Rejected and humiliated, Chukwudi tried to weaponize their divorce proceedings, demanding full custody of the children and painting Blessing as spiritually unfit. He brought church elders as character witnesses, cited the curses, the public scandals, the witch graffiti. For weeks, it looked like Blessing might lose her children, the ultimate consequence. But her lawyer, a sharp woman who'd heard her full story, built a counter-narrative. A faithful wife driven to desperation by serial infidelity. A woman who'd made mistakes but taken full responsibility, versus a man who'd never once taken accountability for destroying his family. The court ruled in Blessing's favor, shared custody with the children primarily with her. Months later, there was a knock at Blessing's door. She opened it to find Adiazi, the former shop girl, standing there with a black eye and a trembling lip. "He hit me," she said simply. "I didn't know where else to go." Blessing stood frozen for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." They sat at her small kitchen table, two women on opposite sides of a war that neither had really won. Adiazi cried. Blessing made tea. Slowly, painfully, they talked about the lies he told each of them, the manipulation, the patterns neither had seen clearly until they were out. "I thought I was special," Adiaze whispered. "I thought he loved me." "I thought the same thing for 15 years, Blessing replied. Something shifted in that moment. Not friendship exactly, but understanding. They'd both been used by the same man, and while the curse had been real, the real poison had always been him. A year later, Blessing's shop was reopening under a new name, Blessing's New Beginning Fabrics. Customers returned slowly, drawn by her honesty, her humility, and the quality of her work. Her children were healing, spending weekends with her, laughing again. She joined a women's support group at church, not as a project, but as a participant, sharing her story to help others avoid her mistakes. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't fully forgiven by everyone. Her marriage was over, but she was free. Free from the prison of other people's expectations, free from the need to be perfect, free from carrying rage that wasn't hers to carry. One evening, standing in her shop alone, she looked at the shelves of colorful fabrics and smiled. She had rebuilt, not the life she lost, but something better, a life that was truly hers. The story closes with Blessing at the market, arranging fabrics, when a young woman approaches, new to town, tearful, whispering about a cheating husband and asking if Blessing knows any native doctor who can help. Blessing pauses, memories flooding back. Then she gently takes the woman's hand and sits her down. "Let me tell you a story," she begins, "about what revenge really costs." The screen fades as Blessing speaks, her voice steady, passing forward the hard-won wisdom that might save this stranger from making the same mistakes. The final image is Blessing's face, no longer desperate, no longer vengeful, but calm, knowing, and at peace.